everybody. We're going to kick off. Some people might still be arriving, but we won't take up any of Mark's time because we want to hear about this exciting topic. I'm really happy to be introducing Mark today, one of our visiting Erskine Fellows this term. So I first crossed paths with Mark about 13 years ago when I was a PhD student here at UC, and I was interested in researching a tool that he'd co-authored, the VRS-SO, which we're going to be hearing a lot more about today. So in trying to figure out how to get in touch with this researcher from Canada, I was using the old-fashioned method of the Google stalk, and I came across a profile of his work in the University of Saskatchewan newspaper from a few years prior, accompanied by a photo of him as a long-haired doctoral student, and also helpfully showing an email address. So we connected at that time, and he was extremely helpful, and we've kept in touch and collaborated a little bit ever since. So we jumped to today, and much has changed. Mark's now a long-haired professor of psychology at the University of Saskatchewan, and of course a visiting Erskine Fellow here at UC. So Mark's academic career since that time has gone from strength to strength. I just had a quick check on, again, Google. He's now published over 100 journal articles and has been cited by his peers 3,300 times. Not to mention that his work has had a huge influence on practice around the world. For example, the VRS-SO tool that we're going to hear about today is now widely used all around New Zealand across different services. And so I think that's another reason why we are welcoming today as well several clinicians from the local community. So thank you for coming along. I hope this is going to be very useful for you as it will be for me. Just as was the case back then, when Mark was happy to help out a random student on the other side of the world, Mark's professional strengths do go far beyond his incredible productivity that I've mentioned, his analytical genius, and innovative ideas that move the field forward. Mark is collegial and generous with his time. He brings a clear clinical awareness to his research. And he's an excellent and inspiring teacher, according to very recent reports that have been coming from our students here at UC. Other talents to mention: playing guitar, excellent choice in wives, and he writes a very convincing letter of recommendation. Thank you kindly. So here we are.
Thank you for heeding my advice.
So as I mentioned at the start, I feel very privileged to be able to welcome Mark and Kira to UC and to Christchurch at this time, and to be introducing Mark today. So I'm now going to leave it to Mark to fill us in on the development of the updated risk categories and recidivism estimates using the VRS-SO. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That's probably the nicest introduction I've ever had, ever. So when this happens, you're like, I should just quit while I'm ahead and let's just go for drinks. You know. Nobody has ever complained about a presentation ending early, hey? Yes, thank you very much for the warm welcome. And actually, the title of this talk is just sort of a snapshot about what I'll be talking about today. Broadly speaking, it'll be about linking assessment and intervention in the evaluation and management of men who commit sex offenses. And so very cool to have a good turnout, faculty, students, and friends and colleagues from the psychological and corrections community. That's really, really cool. Privileged to be here. And can you hear me okay in the back? Is this okay? Level them speaking? All right. Now, I'm going to start off with some pictures. Audiences often like that as well. You know, you start off with, and some of you have already seen this, and so I apologize if you've already seen this, but many of you haven't. And so you'll find this amusing, I think, for the next 30 seconds at least anyhow. So anybody here ever been to Saskatchewan? Yes. Okay. Oh, that's right, because Julia is Canadian. Yeah? And of course, Kira accompanied me down here. There you go. And that's actually Julia's province next over here. And Albertan, correct? Ontarian, okay. Well, you're in good companies, because so is Kira. Kira's also an Ontarian. So there's Saskatoon, south central Saskatchewan. It's kind of shaped like a grain elevator. It's actually the breadbasket of on prairies. And that's how it compares to New Zealand. You can fit the North and South Islands into Saskatchewan if you were to float it down to the South Pacific and have real estate around it geographically. You could probably drive from one side of Saskatchewan to the other in maybe about 5 hours or so, whereas the equivalent distance would probably take you 3 days in New Zealand. That's what it looks like. Seth from Nebraska can appreciate. Joke is, you can watch a dog run away for 3 days. The University of Saskatchewan's just on the right there. No, I'm joking. This is kind of like a random highway in Saskatchewan. That's actually the University of Saskatchewan. That's an aerial view. big medical doctoral university. It's the province's university, about 23,000 students. That's the skyline of Saskatoon. It never typically looks quite that nice, but you see it bathed in the northern lights. And that's what it looks like when it's 30 below in our winter. You can actually see the South Saskatchewan freeze before your eyes when it's about 30 below. And you see the lovely hoarfrost on the river there. It's not 30 below every day in winter, just often enough that it seems like it is. That's our lovely leafy campus. That's what it looks like currently, and that's what it looks like for the other 6 months out of the year. Okay. So as I mentioned today, I'll be talking broadly about the assessment and management of sexual violence risk, featuring the Violence Risk Scale-Sex Offender version, sexual offense version rather, VRS-SO, which I've done a lot of collaborations with Sarah Christopherson on. She's actually a trainer and avid user and researcher of the tool as well. We'll be talking about credible agents to mitigate risk, where we want to intervene when it comes to assessing and managing risk with men who commit sex offenses. I'll be talking about how we can use change information in our assessments, and then I'll be sort of finishing up talking about the VRS-SO and what we've done in terms of risk categories and recidivism metrics for evaluating risk and change, and this will all become more clear as I move on. So, what are credible change agents that reduce risk? So who here is from corrections, just out of curiosity? If I can just have a quick show of hands. Okay, great. And so a big task that you have is evaluating risk for reoffending in the community. You do part of that, right? And you evaluate risk to, don't worry, I'm not gonna call on you, that's okay. Don't look frightened, okay? I won't. I promise you I'll be doing both a good and bad thing, most of the talking for this next hour. But you also do assessments for identifying where to intervene in treatment. And treatment is intended to bring down risks so that they can be managed in the community, and hopefully they can go on to a life free of sexual violence, not committing new offenses, right? And the whole important publicly funded enterprise making communities safer. So what reduces risk? If you have a person who's committed, say, a sexually violent offense, like say they've sexually abused a child or attempted to sexually assault an adult person or whatever, what might reduce their potential for doing that again, aside from 4 concrete walls around them? Although incapacitation certainly is part of that. We could have treatment. We have some treatment service providers here. We have a clinical program at UC. I like treatment. How about growing older? Is the risk, say, same for somebody who's 25 years of age versus someone who's 85 years of age? When we think about the physical changes that happen with aging, certainly. How about a serious change in health, like, I don't know, coma? Or a friend and colleague of mine, he's used this term called, unfortunately, prisons, especially in North America, I'm not sure if it's the case down here in New Zealand, but they aren't known for, guys can be very physically active in prison, quite fit, but oftentimes they're not, and the prison food's cheap and so forth. And so you see people with these mounting health concerns and developing type 2 diabetes and cardiac problems and so forth. Yeah, Julia, their nutrition's horrible, And so a friend of mine coined the term therapeutic obesity, actually, because these people sometimes get quite obese and develop health problems that they're hardly in any position to commit a spate of new offenses just because of ill health. How about getting married, having a pro-social, romantic partner? Maybe that could reduce risk. Or maybe an improvement in community supports, etc. So one of my favorite quotes to capture this notion of trying to help people make changes and move on to better lives is coined by Don Andrews, Jim Bonta, and Bob Hogue back in 1990. This is sort of the, I guess you could say, the foundation of what we would call the general responsivity principle. Effective rehabilitative efforts involve workers who are interpersonally warm, tolerant, flexible, yet sensitive to conventional rules and procedures. So I'm often considered a bit of a tree hugger in my field because I have this sort of humane approach that I advocate towards offenders. I know a lot of people do, certainly. But I guess it's Paul Meehl who argued we should be soft-hearted and hard-headed rather than soft-headed and hard-hearted. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the risk-need responsivity principles because it gives you a little bit of a foundation for the material I'm covering. Who here has heard of risk-need responsivity or R&R? So a number of you have, okay. So for those of you who aren't familiar, I'll just talk about briefly. Risk is basically just this administrative dosage principle. You match service intensity to basically the amount of problems or the risk level of the client. Higher risk people get more services, lower risk people get less services. You know, you don't need to, hey Liz, you don't need to shoot a mosquito with a cannon, right? Certainly. Need means that we target criminogenic needs or dynamic risk variables, which I'll be talking about shortly for services in order to reduce risk. They're called criminogenic needs because they're crime causing. It's the genesis of crime, so to speak. And then responsivity means that we basically have this sort of warm, empathic, engaging approach when we work with correctional clientele, tailored to their unique abilities and idiosyncratic characteristics within the context of a cognitive behavioral model of intervention. When we follow all three of these principles, we see a 26% reduction in general recidivism. That's denoted by the red bar on the far right-hand side of your screen. When you follow 2 out of the 3, you see an 18% reduction. It's Phi coefficient there. Not bad. If you follow only one of the principles, and usually that's just risk, that means you're basically providing more services to higher risk people, but the content is actually rubbish. You can see that there's a 2% decrease, and if you're not following any of them, you actually have a slight increase. And if we apply this to the treatment of men who've committed sex offenses, the risk-need responsivity principles also apply. This is kind of a funky graph that was published by Hanson and colleagues on a recent meta-analysis of sexual offense-specific interventions. Basically, the darker the bubble, the more principles adhered to, and if it drifts below the line, this means that there's an association with reduced sexual recidivism. And so and the size of the bubble is the number of persons who are enrolled in the program. And what you see are basically darker bubbles drifting below the line, which means larger effects associated with an adherence to a successfully larger number of R&R principles. So why am I starting off on this treatment note? The reason why I'm starting off with this treatment note is that if we're in the process of evaluating change, and if people have reduced their risk and they can be managed in the community, we should be evaluating a program that's actually capable of bringing about change. So if we were trying to evaluate change and people were engaged in, I don't know, sandwich board justice and diaper therapy and maybe some dunce cap therapy on top of it, well, Paul Gendreau calls this correctional quackery. I think it was the governor of Arizona who once had inmates dress in pink underwear, I think it was. Humiliating people is not an effective way of bringing about change. So if we want to evaluate changes in risk and have an opportunity to capture this, these need to be evidence-informed interventions. So, can we just intervene in any old area? Can we just, I don't know, maybe have people become more empathy and empathic and absolving and warm and nice and turn them into Mother Teresa? Is that a viable treatment target? Is it realistic? Do we expect these people to, I don't know, pick up a permanent position at UC in one of the faculty? You know, maybe that's happened, right? But you know, where do we intervene? Where is it that we are prioritizing our services when we're trying to help these men bring about changes in their life? So, Ruth Mann, Carl Hanson, David Thornton, and David Thornton, yes, is the therapeutic obesity guy. He's not therapeutically obese, he just coined the term. They did coin this term called psychologically meaningful risk factors, and what's a fairly influential meta-analysis that came out about 8 years ago now. And they argued that if we want to identify promising targets for intervention and also for risk assessment, these should be areas that are predictive of future sexual violence in this population and that are plausible possible causes of sexual violence. And so if programs are going to be effective, where should we be funneling our resources? They should be into these psychologically meaningful risk factors. And yes, in case you're wondering, are psychologically meaningful risk factors similar to criminogenic needs? It's basically the same, just different nomenclature for the same phenomenon. So AKA criminogenic needs or dynamic risk factors. And so if we do target these, then these should bring the largest reductions in recidivism, the biggest bang for our buck. So this is a fairly small print screen slide. I do apologize for that, but what I have highlighted in yellow there are basically what would be examples of psychologically meaningful risk factors identified through the meta-analytic literature. So these would be things like basically what we would call sexual preoccupation, which means an obsession with or fascination with sex beyond what's normal for people. People who might spend a lot of time having aberrant or unusual fantasies, people who might have a very large and varied number of partners, or who have atypical and bizarre interests, for instance, and who are, for the most part, preoccupied with sex. That's been shown to be a predictor of recidivism. Or any deviant sexual interest. Underneath it, this would be things like having pedophilic interest, like sexual attraction to children, or maybe a fascination or arousal to sex involving violence and humiliation, or it could really be any paraphilia for that matter. Not to cast judgment or anything, but paraphilias do predict sexual recidivism in a population of people who've had trouble with their sexual behavior. So those would be examples of some psychologically meaningful risk factors, and there's a whole number of them, like if somebody has attitudes that are supportive of sexual violence, or if somebody has an antisocial and irresponsible, unstable lifestyle, negative social influences, or problem regulating anger and hostility and negative emotion. These are also psychologically meaningful risk factors. What doesn't predict particularly well? Things like a view of self as inadequate. That's a very kind of a wild card predictor. For some strange reason, low self-esteem seems to predict really well in the UK. I don't know why low self-esteem predicts really well in the UK. It just does. It doesn't predict particularly well in the US, and it's kind of hit or miss in Canada. I have a data set in which low self-esteem actually does predict recidivism, interestingly. I don't know why it does, it just happens to. But it's not a particularly robust risk factor. And you've probably heard this in conventional lore. Well, why does so-and-so commit offenses? Why do they target children? Well, it's because they have low self-esteem. And low self-esteem, I think, could be construed as what we might call a non-criminogenic need. It might be helpful from a well-being and psychological health standpoint, but it might not be etiologically tied to risk. And then what frankly does not predict sexual violence? Emotional problems, interestingly, not of the anger or emotional discontrol variety, but things like depression, personal distress, anxiety, and so on and so forth. And actually lack of empathy, interestingly, aren't particularly strong predictors. So this is informative because this is where we should probably be putting our resources in terms of assessing and managing risk. So we've identified a large number of global and specific psychological constructs. And so the way our sexual offense programs operate around the globe, for the most part, is that they are geared towards targeting psychologically meaningful risk factors. And not just doing this in the vacuum. Part of the treatment, and I'm not going to talk much more about treatment, is not only having people overcome these problem areas, but also develop pro-social problem-solving skills. Like if you take away, say, someone's fantasies about children, for instance, and maybe they've engaged in viewing child pornography and had sexual contact with children and so forth, we wouldn't expect them to become asexual beings. Now, some people might want a person who's committed a sex offense to be an asexual being, but humans are sexual. It's a big part of human functioning. So what would the alternative be? Well, you would help people develop healthy sexuality and pro-social outlets. So age-appropriate consenting adult partners would certainly be what you would want to increase. And so where there's a criminogenic need that's targeted, it's not just a purely deficit-driven approach, but it also helps people, it also involves having people develop new thoughts and feelings and behaviors, new pro-social skills that we all take for granted that enable us to live lives free of crime and lives that are worth living. So, just as if we're evaluating changes in risk, we want to make sure it's a program that is evidence-informed. When we're also evaluating changes in risk, we also want to make sure that we're targeting domains that are actually risk relevant. So if somebody showed a lot of changes, say, in self-esteem and they're feeling a lot less depressed and anxious, does that mean that they're lower risk for sexual violence? Not necessarily. I mean, we probably don't want people sitting around feeling depressed and anxious. Like, we should certainly intervene in those areas, absolutely. But from a risk management standpoint, they might hold less relevance. How do you know when somebody's changed? Somebody's got a history of sexual violence. How do you know when they've changed? And how do you know when they're a safe release risk to go back to the community?
Deceased.
They're deceased, yes. or they have that serious, that significant change in health, as I mentioned before. Coma, yes. Well, arguably, if we're evaluating changes in risk on these psychologically meaningful risk factors, just being mindful of time here, arguably changes on these factors should be associated with reductions in recidivism. So if this is where we should be putting our resources, if people do make positive changes on these areas, then we should see fewer returns to custody, and in particular, we should see the commission of fewer acts of sexual violence. So this is where I'm going to talk about the Violence Risk Scale-Sexual Offence version, as Sarah had mentioned in the introduction. And so the VRS-SO, I would argue, is made up of psychologically meaningful risk factors. Some are probably more predictive than others. But what it is it is a sexual violence risk assessment treatment planning tool designed to assess risk for future sexual offending, identify targets and treatment that can be prioritized for services, and to evaluate changes in risk from treatment and other change agents. The idea is what we've been spending a lot of time on in our program of research, and Sarah's been very helpful in this as well, is evaluating, well, how do we make use of this change information on these dynamic factors? How can we incorporate it into our final appraisal? So if somebody's gone through a program, could be a sexual offense specific program, could be other programs, substance use, anger management, et cetera. How do we make use of that change information, and how do we use it to inform our appraisals of sexual violence? How do we use that information to know that somebody's, say, a safe bet to be released back to the community, and how we could support that person? So we talked about the VRS-SO in this regard. By virtue of its attempt to evaluate change and to basically, I guess, serve this process from the point of intake to case closure in assessing somebody's risk and documenting their changes, we would call this a fourth generation tool. So these are the items. As I mentioned before, I would argue that they're psychologically meaningful risk factors. There's 7 static items and 17 dynamic items. I won't go through all of them, but your static items, there are a number of static sexual offense risk tools that have been developed. The most common one used on the planet is the static 99R. Great tool. I use it for a lot of my evaluations as well. And you can actually use it with the dynamic items in the VRS-SO. We've actually developed a framework where you can, if you don't like our static items, you can basically pop it off and put on the static 99R instead, actually, which is convenient since it's been replicated so many times the world over. The static items are basically offense history, sexual and non-sexual offense history, and offender and victim demographics. The dynamic items are items that are theoretically, clinically, and conceptually linked to increased sexual violence. And so they kind of fall under the rubric of 3 kind of broad areas, what we would call sexual deviance, like your atypical sexual interest or sexual preoccupation, for instance, or lifestyle that's congruent to sexually deviant activities. We have a domain that we call general criminality. And this is kind of a very broad risk need domain. It's kind of this broad propensity for rule violation. There's a collection of dynamic risk factors, general risk factors called the central 8, which sort of fall under this criminality domain. These would be things like negative friends, lifestyle impulsivity. It's not part of the central 8, but it's a variable on our instrument. Family and marital problems, substance abuse problems, poor use of leisure recreation time, employment problems, and so forth. On the VRS-SO, these would be things like impulsivity, poor cooperation with community supervision, lack of community supports, and the like would fall into your general criminality domain. And then we have a final category called treatment responsivity, which kind of gets at the attitudes and cognitions that people have to legitimize sexual violence. So that would be things like cog distortion. That's basically just a very general term for not like the post hoc rationalizations people might have for bad behavior, but these would be fairly stable scripts and schemas that people have that legitimize sexually offending sorts of sexually abusive behavior. It would also include things like insight or lack of cooperation with sexual offense specific treatment. The items are all scored on a 4-point scale from 0 to 3. The higher the score, the stronger the link to sexual violence. There has been a movement with some actuarial scales that are data-driven to have items that are differentially weighted based on the magnitude of their relationship with the recidivism criterion. We didn't do that, we just kept it simple, KISS, keep it simple, sweetheart. That was kind of our approach. There wasn't a lot of evidence that one variable was particularly stronger variable than the other. And you also have the problem with sometimes weights don't generalize across jurisdictions and so forth, so we just kept it straightforward that way. So the dynamic items are intended to change. The static items only change if you have the right birthday or if you commit more offenses. So they're not too terribly dynamic. What we've done is we have taken Prochaska and colleagues' stages of change model. Who here has heard of stages of change? Okay, so trans-theoretical model. It was developed out of health psychology and behavioral medicine, and basically argues that there's a sequential set of cognitive and behavioral and experiential processes that people go through as they remediate problem areas in their life. So it's not like, let's say you wanted to increase exercise adherence and you've never run before. It's not like you're going to be like, well, I'm going to get up tomorrow, I'm going to start running 5 miles a day, 5 days a week, and I'm going to drop 50 pounds in the next 2 months. It's probably not particularly realistic. Maybe some people have actually done that. But if you ever try to, say, improve your dietary habits, or say quit smoking, or increase your exercise adherence, and so on and so forth, chances are, you think about the problem area first, you try out some new behaviors, you fall off the wagon a little bit. It's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Maybe you get some information support before you start trying out behaviors. And it's this gradual process before you start having long-term changes sustained over a period of time and then generalize across a range of contexts. So if you're an ex-smoker, for instance, you can, in time, hang around your smoking friends and not necessarily light up. That would be the hallmark of maintenance. But if in the early stages where you're thinking, well, maybe I should try to quit smoking, but early days, probably not a good idea to be hanging around your smoking friends, for instance, when they light up, if you're trying to abstain from it. So the notion of pre-contemplation is that basically somebody has a problem area and they're not aware of that they have a problem area, or they like the problem area and they're not willing to change. So someone either is content with smoking, or you could apply it to, say, any of the dynamic risk items, like someone has a deviant sexual preference, for instance. A lot of these men, they enjoyed their deviant fantasy world. That's what floats their boat, so to speak. They may be reluctant to give it up, or they may be not able to come to terms with those interests. And that's fine at the outset of treatment. It's something to work with, certainly. When somebody moves into an awareness of the problem area, we would call that contemplation. So somebody could be aware that, okay, these interests in children are problematic and they increase my risk, and I should probably learn to manage this better, but there's actually no behavioral change. When somebody starts using skills and strategies to manage a problem area, we would call that pre-contemplation, and the changes are recent relative to one's lifetime functioning, and lapses tend to be fairly frequent. So somebody might, say, use what we would call directed masturbation, where they might change the thematic content of a fantasy, for instance, to something that's age-appropriate and consenting and so forth, but use that inconsistently when it comes to pleasuring themselves, for instance. And so we would call that preparation. But when someone has sustained use of skills and strategies over an extended period of time, then we would call that action. And then when you see generalization and transfer of that learning across a variety of contexts and basically absence of the problem area, we would call that maintenance. And so we have operationalized these 5 stages of change across each of the 17 dynamic items. And so basically what happens is that any item that's identified with the 2 or 3 rating, they're considered to be criminogenic, risk relevant, and treatment targets. We give them baseline stage of change rating at the beginning of services, and then we give them a stage of change rating that we re-rate after services at post-treatment. And basically there's a quantitative reduction if somebody has moved along the stage of change from one stage to the next in the direction of progress, amounting to about half a point. You might think, well, that's pretty Mickey Mouse, like half a point. But don't forget, there's 17 items. So 17 divided by half a point, if someone happened to do that, that would be 8.5 points of change, which, by the way, is a full standard deviation. You might think, okay, so do you have any data on this change score and this information? The answer is yes. We spend a lot of time doing this. And so this is the rationale behind how we compute change scores, and I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about how we make use of that information and some of the strategies we've come up with. Before I get onto this, I'm going to, again, some of you have seen this game, and if you haven't seen it, and some of you have actually played this game if you're VRS-SO trainers. Megan's smiling in the back there, so sit on your hands, Megan. All right, and Sarah. We're going to play a game. It's estimate that risk level. Okay. So let's say we have a 2x2 table. of change in risk level. And let's say we have a person, and we'll give them this really informative name. We'll call them offender A. Let's say offender A is rated on a risk tool, and they have a score of 50. Could be the VRS-SO, which has a 72-point range. And they make 7 points of change, and they have a post-treatment score of 43. Is their risk lower? What do you think? Good to go? Release them? You'd be happy with them living in your neighborhood? Take the bus with them? Sit down, have coffee on Thursdays? What do you think? I haven't provided you a lot of information. You might be thinking, is this a trick question? And kind of it is, but okay, well, I'll give you some more context. Let's say there's offender B. Offender B goes to treatment. And offender B has half the score of offender A, a score of 25. Offender B behaves like a horse's rear end in treatment. They make no points of change. They come out of treatment with a post-treatment score of 25. Shame on you, offender B. Didn't make the most of treatment. Who's higher risk now, offender A or offender B? We'll call them, I don't know, Adam and Bruce. Who's higher risk? Bruce. You know what? I would want to say Bruce. Bruce will get a more negative report than me. But ultimately, unfortunately, it's Adam. World's not a fair place. Adam made this change, but he's higher risk than Bruce. Any guess why? Because, yes, he has a higher baseline. Yes, you bet. So even though Adam made changes and made positive changes, he has a higher baseline. So like, let's say, put it in different clinical language. Let's say Adam had major depressive disorder with psychotic features and decreased his BDI score by, like, say, 5 points. And Bruce came in and was having an adjustment disorder, maybe had a BDI of 10 and didn't decrease it at all, and basically stormed out of your office and called you, you know, an idiot, who's still more depressed. Adam's still more depressed, still needs more services, et cetera, even though we'd be like, okay, well, see you, Bruce. I hope spontaneous remission greets you, you know. Or we hope that you grow into your frontal lobe. Okay, so we have offender C. We'll call him offender C, Carl. Has a pre-treatment score of 50, makes no points of change, has a post-treatment score of 50. Now who's highest risk? Yes, you bet. And why is Carl higher risk than Adam? Higher score, but also no change. So even though they had the same kind of baseline, one person makes some improvement and one person doesn't. And then finally we have offender D, we'll call him Derek. Derek comes in, kind of like Bruce, but walks the walk like Adam, makes 5 points of change, walks in with a low score, walks out with an even lower score. Now who's lowest risk? Probably D or A. Well, actually, here's a question for you. Who's lower risk, D or A? Jenny, I don't typically ask that, but you inspired me to ask that. So who's lower risk, A or D? Adam or Derek? Yes, so Derek still is because he still has the lower baseline, even though they made comparable amounts of change. So for those of you who work in corrections, this happens, hey? And this happens a lot, right? And you need to sort out the Adams from the Bruces, from the Carls, from the Dereks, because they're in your groups and you're making appraisals of them all the time. You're like, well, who do you release? Who do you not release? Do you want Adam to make more change before you can take a chance on him, even if you have aggressive community supervision? Is his score still too high? How do we know? How do we use this information so that we're not just like, looks like he's made a lot of change. It's probably safe release risk. So we've actually looked at this empirically, and Sarah and I are writing this up right now, actually. You could take these 4 groups, and we've recreated them with VRS-SO data, actually. We have 4 groups that are approximately equal size. Low risk, low change, low risk, high change, high risk, low change, and high risk, high change. And what I have here are the ends. I had mentioned the static 99R, this 10-item static actuarial instrument that's used the world over. We have ratings on them as well. Their baseline pre-treatment score and their change score. You can see that the two low risk groups are pretty much the same in terms of baseline risk, both static and dynamic. Same with the two high risk groups. But where they differ is in terms of their change. So you see about 5 points for the low risk high change, about 6 points for the high risk high change. So what happens if we look at recidivism patterns of these people? What do we see? And we've done that. So here's what we see. I'm like, okay, so whose line is whose? So that's low risk low change. That's offender B, that's Bruce. So this is a survival curve, by the way. This is the trajectory of new sexual charges and convictions over a period of time. We have up to 30 years follow-up on some of these people who've been followed in the community. So a fairly shallow trajectory of sexual recidivism. We compare them to, say, Derek. That's an even shallower trajectory. And that's actually a statistically significant difference between those two survival curves, just to let you know. So Derek was actually lower risk than Bruce and had very low rates of return to custody for new sexual offenses. And that's Carl, who has the steepest trajectory of offending as we would expect. And that's Adam, who's got a shallower trajectory than Carl, but steeper than the two low-risk groups. And so we've seen this empirically. What's very interesting, though, about this is, again, recall what their static scores happen to be. So on static 99, basically a score 2 is the average score in the overall sample, and below that you're looking at somebody who tends to be pretty low risk. And it tends not to change, again, unless you have the right birthday or commit more offenses. So we see that they're quite comparable between the two groups, and between Adam and Bruce, they differ on change. But then we look at Carl and Derek. They have a score of 5. That tends to be what used to be called moderate high risk, and it's now called above average risk, actually. This would be about the 85th percentile, just to give you some context here. So 1 standard deviation or more, actually probably more than that, probably about 1.5 standard deviations above the mean compared to most men assessed on this who have sex offenses. But look how close they are. So imagine that the only tool you had was a static one, like the static 99R. Let's say that was your only tool that you were using. You didn't use something dynamic. What would be happening? And you're making this decision about whether or not to release people. You're releasing them only on the basis of their static 99R scores. I'm sorry? You treat them the same. And what does that mean? What are the implications of that? Do you think that there would be fewer Adams getting released if you were treating them the same? And probably Adam's actually a safer release risk. So you would have false positives. You would be over-predicting sexual violence risk if all you were using was a static tool. Why? Because if all you can do is have the right birthday or commit more offenses, even if you've been a rock star in treatment, a static tool will not be able to capture that. And so that's the problem. And if we look at general violence, by the way, we see the same thing. This is any kind of this could be a new sex offense or a non-sexually violent offense, like a robbery or a homicide or a non-sexual assault. And even if we go down to general, good old-fashioned general recidivism, which is anything from snatching a purse to stealing a car to, I don't know, I guess jaywalking when the cops had a bad day or whatever, on top of sexual and non-sexual violent offending, we see the same trend as well. So where am I going with this? When assessing risk, it's critical to account for baseline risk level. This is the thing that's really important. So it's not just about capturing changes in risk and identifying these relevant treatment targets and so forth. Somehow we need to account for this higher baseline in some way. If somebody's more severely depressed and they've made some change, we need to account for that baseline somehow. If somebody's higher risk, they progress well in treatment, we need to account for that baseline somehow. This also underscores the importance of using a dynamic tool when it comes to evaluating risk. Static 99R is great. As I mentioned before, I use it in a lot of my own evaluations, but if you're using a static tool, you should also be using one or more dynamic tools. So how do we use this change information? We know that there's a change effect, or that the potential exists anyways. By the way, I forgot to mention, one of those samples that went into that's a combination of 4 samples. One actually comes from the Kia Medema program at Ralston Prison, by the way. That's about a quarter of the individuals in that sample. So very large effect actually coming out of Kia Medema. So that was Sarah's dissertation actually. So So I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that Sarah and I published with Randy Grace and Steve Wong about how to harness this change information and to systematically incorporate it into our appraisals. One way of doing it, and I'll move through this fairly quickly and not get bogged down in the math, but basically there's been advancements in risk communication using logistic regression modeling. And so basically, for those of you familiar with logistic regression, I guess for those of you not familiar with it, is basically just a type of regression where you predict a binary outcome. Yes, no, so recidivate, not recidivate. If you take a look on the screen there, that's the static 2002. It's a cousin of the static 99 and the 99R. There's 13 possible scores on it. If you look at that, these are the portion of people who go on to reoffend sexually. Now, in principle, the higher the score, the higher the rate of recidivism you should see. But with extreme scores, because extreme scores are extremely uncommon, the cell frequencies are small, and so the absolute rate of recidivism, the number of recidivists, becomes very unstable. For people with a score of 13, I think there was like one of them actually in this big sample, and that person didn't reoffend. So you see it falls down at the bottom there that has a 0 rate of recidivism in that category. But what should the rate of recidivism be? Well, what you can do is you can take the association between static 2002 R score and recidivism using this log linking function right there. Take it as a function of the rate of recidivism overall in the sample, and then using that log linking function, you can actually project or estimate their rate of sexual recidivism over a defined follow-up. In this case, it's 5 years for each score on the instrument. And that would be the smoothed curve that you see in blue right there. And that would be, and actually you know that it fits a logistic distribution well because it's basically an S-shaped curve. So the association between risk scores and recidivism isn't perfectly linear. It follows this kind of logistic distribution, which captures it pretty nicely. So what we've done is we've done the same thing with the VRS-SO in a nutshell, and we found that it's worked pretty well. So rather than having, say, groups of scores that fall into risk categories and what the rates of recidivism are attached to those scores, we have used logistic regression in order to estimate rates of recidivism attached to specific scores. And so, again, following up with that data, this is the change effect. You saw it in the previous slide as well. We could take people who might have low change, medium change, and high change. These are people who are basically a standard deviation above the mean in change, which is the shallow line up top. People who had average change, say plus or minus a standard deviation, that's the dotted line in the middle. Again, this is the survival curve for sexual recidivism. Those with low change, you can see a much steeper trajectory. By using logistic regression modeling, in this particular case, the VRS-SO used to have 4 risk categories. We take the mean score for each risk category. That's our datum that we put into the log linking function. We could take a certain amount of change, high, medium, or low. Specifically, that would be 6 points. That would be 3.5 points, and that would be, say, no points on average for low change. And then we can put them into these groups here based on their baseline risk and their level of change. So it's more systematic. It's a way of integrating the 2 pieces of information. It's using logistic regression modeling. This is fine. Better than just eyeballing it, certainly. And so we did this for a number of years. So, but we could do it better as well. So we could, rather than just saying, well, somebody's within the moderate risk group, this is what the mean happens to be, we could actually harness logistic regression modeling by using exact scores. So what if somebody, like an Adam, actually had a baseline score of 43, they made 7 points of change. Can we put that into a logistic regression equation and say, well, this is the 5-year estimate for Adam? And the answer is yes, we can do that. And yes, we have done that. And so this is where it kind of come to the thrust of the talk is our recent efforts in doing this. And so it's a paper, it's finally been assigned an issue, Sarah. So July issue of Psych Assessment has come out taking this information, and we have put together this Excel workbook calculator. We call it the VRS-SO calculator. It's available online. A lot of people use it. Basically, you just take your risk scores, you put it in there. We have the regression coefficients. Basically, in the user workbook itself, you put in the specific scores, and it spits out an estimated 5 or 10 year rate of recidivism along with 95% confidence intervals for that. And again, if you don't like the static factors, you can substitute the static 99R. In the US, that's a really popular combination. And so we've written up this change data, this risk and change data featuring the VRS-SO calculator in psych assessment. So This is where we come to a common language. What we're moving away from, historically we've used the language low, medium, and high to characterize risk level. And the problem is that this is a fairly arbitrary metric of recidivism. If I tell you that somebody is high risk for sexual violence, you say that to a judge, that could be interpreted as 100% probability. But let's say the base rate of your criterion over a 5-year follow-up is only 15%. Is high risk 100%? Probably not. If you're looking at absolute rates of recidivism, high risk score over a 5-year follow-up is usually about maybe 35%, 40%. Actually, it's probably more likely the person's actually not going to reoffend because there are more people who don't reoffend than who do. But the problem is that sometimes there are arbitrary methods used to derive these risk labels, but even more problematically, even if the methods to derive them aren't arbitrary, the way that they're interpreted happens to be. Somebody might also hear the term low risk, they might think, oh, low risk, oh, no risk, that's fine. So the guy's offended against children, that's okay, he can move across the daycare, that's fine, across the street from a daycare. But no, so risk is flexible and fluid, but we need to have a lot of caution and a lot of responsibility when it comes to communicating that. So there's been a movement towards using these more neutral labels by the Council of State Governments in Washington and the US, and we call this a common risk language. And again, if you're a person who is being evaluated for conditional release and someone's like, yeah, you're high risk or you're very high risk for sexual violence. Oh no, how'd you feel it? Yeah. Or the person who's moved in across the street from you, well, that person was very high risk for sexual violence, but they did really well in treatment and they're being managed right now. Not a lot of warm fuzzies in a statement like very high. Not that we're about warm fuzzies here. So there's this common language framework. These are the rates of recidivism that are attached to them. So we call them levels. Level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Level 1 is basically somebody who made a mistake. They feel terrible about it. They're very unlikely to ever do anything criminal again. Less than a 5% rate of recidivism. Somebody who is level 2 has maybe a couple isolated areas of need. Maybe they've got a drinking problem, for instance, and maybe some anger issues. But otherwise, they could be a pro-social, fairly high-functioning person, can keep a job, they have some supports in their life, and so forth. You see lower rates of 2-year recidivism. The most common, this would be someone who's category 3. This makes up about 50% of offenders. They have a number of different criminogenic needs. You see about a 30 to 49% rate of recidivism. Those who are level 4 have got chronic problem areas, lots of criminogenic needs. They could have drug and alcohol problem, anger problem, strained family and marital ties, weak employment history, etc. Maybe they have some strengths and resiliencies, though, that prevent them from vaulting into category 5, which is about an 85% recidivism. And this is any kind of reoffending, just to let you know. This is general reoffending. But in this case, you would have someone who has chronic and long-standing problems. But sexual recidivism is a fairly low base rate outcome. And that's a good thing. We don't want there to be lots of this when people are released. So how can you apply these categories to sexual recidivism? My suggestion in the conversation was, well, I think you just need to move the goalposts, actually, is what you need to do. People didn't like that suggestion very much, and so what they've done is they've taken level 4 and they've sort of put it into level 4A and level 4B. So there are verbal labels that go along with this. Level 1 is often called very low. Level 2 is called below average. Level 3 is called average. Level 4A is above average, and level 4B is well above average. And so we've adopted this 5-category scheme with a low and a high variant of level 4 to the VRS-SO. So I've talked about the sample composition. 3 of these are Canadian samples. These are men who were convicted for sexual offenses and administered by the Correctional Service of Canada, our federal correctional department in Canada, and who received treatment services of a range of intensities. Most of them were actually from Saskatchewan's Regional Treatment Centre, which is a high-intensity program. But again, a quarter of them also came from the Kia Merima program. When we were developing these norms, we decided to make sure that people had at least 10 years of follow-up in the community, even if we were looking at 5-year and 10-year outcomes in Canada. The reason for this is that in Canada, our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they're responsible for updating criminal records of people whenever they get into trouble. there's a lot of variability from one detachment to the next, and at one point, the RCMP were actually 2 years behind in updating criminal records. And so you might think that's pretty significant. So I updated this outcome data like 3 times for one of the samples. And I remember updating it in 2011, and we had this low base rate, which is good. A friend of mine framed it, low base rates are good for life, bad for science. But in 2015, when I updated it again, there were entries from 2009 that had not been updated in 2011. And that was the first time they had come around. So it was actually David Thornton's suggestion, yes, the therapeutic obesity guy, also co-author STAC99R, to have 10 years of follow-up for everybody. I'm going to have to tell David that I use his name in conjunction with therapeutic obesity 4 times in a talk. And then we put this into an Excel spreadsheet, the so-called the VRS-SO calculator, which is available online. You can put your own scores in there if you like. No, I'm just joking. It's not like a BMI calculator. It's very, very, very different, just to let you know. This is a very busy table that has the means and standard deviations of the sample. There's a fair amount of variability. The Clearwater samples, bookending the table there, these tended to be higher risk, higher needs men's who went through a high intensity program. The Kia Merima program is also a high intensity program, but they tended to be a little bit lower risk than our 2 Clearwater samples. The one in the middle called NASOP, that's the National Sex Offender Program, and that for about 10 years was the 3-tiered sexual violence reduction program provided by Correctional Service of Canada, offered at 3 intensity levels: low, which is basically like 6 weeks, moderate, which is about 4 months, and high, which is about 8 to 9 months. And so that's just kind of the breakdown of scores there, and so we do see some variability amongst them, and in terms of rates of recidivism. But when rates of recidivism do vary amongst these 4 samples, it's primarily due to individual differences in static and dynamic risk factors. So risk is kind of driving the boat, so to speak. So how did we do this? Well, we looked at percentile ranks. So basically how risky is one person compared to another person when coming up with risk categories. So we use percentiles all the time in intelligence testing, administering a WACE. You know, somebody's 2 standard deviations above the mean, 98th percentile. They're superior, or I think it's upper extreme now. I used to teach a course of cognitive assessment, and that's useful. Why can't we apply it to risk assessment? If somebody's 2 standard deviations above the mean on the VRS-SO, is that useful information? If somebody's at the 98th percentile, is that helpful to know? Sure. Let's say somebody's at the 98th percentile before treatment and they make no change, and they're at the 98th percentile after treatment. Is that useful from a risk management perspective? So yes, absolutely. And so percentile ranks are very helpful, obviously. So we took that into consideration in forming these risk categories. Obviously, the higher risk somebody happens to be, these are more extreme and uncommon scores. So those cells should be populated by a smaller number of cases. And then, of course, we looked at rates of recidivism. So rates of recidivism should be lining up with more extreme scores as well. Higher scores should have higher rates of recidivism. And so we overlaid this by using logistic regression modeling. So that's just our happy histogram for 913 people who had 10 years of follow-up. I went into the calculator. The thing that's kind of interesting is that if you look at the density of criminogenic needs, so these are the 17 dynamic items, binary coded if it was criminogenic or not, and you took the mean number of needs, you see this sort of stepwise increase. The dynamic scores of the criminogenic needs are denoted by the orange bar, associated with each increase in risk level, which is exactly what you should see. So if somebody's level 1, and we didn't have a lot of level 1s in our sample, but we did, the guys primarily in the low intensity programs, we see that they had maybe like 1 or 2 needs, versus those who are in 4B, and they have about 14 out of 17 needs on average. And this is kind of what you would expect. And you can see that the static scores are kind of staggered across the groups, which makes a lot more sense compared to the dynamic scores, because offense history and victim demographics, they are correlated certainly with dynamic risk and need, but they aren't perfect parallels by any means. So I'm going to make a final point and then I'll wrap up. But another thought experiment, and yes, I'm kind of trying to trick you again, but you're wise to this now. So let's reconsider Adam and Carl. So our 2 high-risk fellers, one who had made change, one who hadn't. Let's say that Adam, instead of starting off with 50 and making 7 points of change, let's say Adam started off with a score of 57. and made 7 points of change, and then had a score of 50. And then we have Carl, who started off with 50, still made no change, and then finished with 50. Is there a difference in their risk level? Their post-treatment score is still 50. Is a 50 a 50? If somebody has a higher baseline, Jeannie's onto me. Somebody has a higher baseline, but they end up at the same place. Are they actually in the same place? And I remember two of my friends and colleagues, Steve Wong and Audrey Gordon, they get in arguments all the time about this. And Steve would be like, no, they're not different. I was like, I know they are. I'm like, well, we have data for this. So let's say we take we'll start lower. We have a pretreatment score of, say, 30. And we have no points of change. And we have a post-treatment score of 30. That's our estimated 5-year rate of sexual recidivism, 11%, and our estimated 10-year rate of sexual recidivism, 17%. Let's say you take another person who starts off with a baseline score of 35. They make 5 points of change. They have the same post-treatment score of 30. They have a 5-year estimate of 8.2, a 10-year estimate of 13.1. By the way, I use the calculator to generate these. But let's say we go up even higher. We have a pre-treatment score of 40. We make 10 points of change. We're looking at about 1/3 standard deviations now. We have still the same post-treatment score of 30. We now have a 5-year estimate of 6% and a 10-year estimate of 9.9%. So in this case, you see you have 3 post-treatment scores, 30, 30, 30. But they had different baselines beforehand. So the answer is that the same post-treatment score can mean very different things. If we move this up, if let's say we move the baseline and we go up 10 points, somebody who started off at 40 and made no change, they have a post-treatment of 40 associated with a 21.9% 5-year rate of sexual recidivism, 32.7% 10-year rate of sexual recidivism, compared to, say, somebody who started at 45 or 50 who made change. Again, you can see that the risk estimates have decreased substantially, even though somebody had a higher baseline. And then we see this even more so when you increase the baseline. So in this case, say we start off with 50 to 60 points. Again, same post-treatment score might mean very different things. So again, we use this calculator and logistic regression to account for baseline risk in this manner. But it's interesting because a 50 is not necessarily a 50, or a 30 is not necessarily a 30. It's counterintuitive, but it makes sense in a lot of ways. And I would also argue that this applies to psychological measurement of other constructs. I would argue. Why wouldn't it? If it applies to risk, and if we have different projected rates of recidivism, you know, if somebody has, I don't know, if somebody has a BDI of 14 and they started off with 14, and somebody has a BDI of 14 and they started off with a 21, is the BDI of 14 the same as the BDI of 14? I don't know. Let's link it up with some kind of behavioral criteria of, say, life functioning, for instance. But I would submit that they could be different. You know, this could apply to other areas of psychological measurement, arguably. So this is what it looks like when you combine it all together. You have these nominal risk categories from very low risk up to well above average. You have these nominal categories, and then you have basically and so this is norm reference testing, norm reference groups. And then we have criterion reference groups based on rates of recidivism estimated for these scores falling within that range. And so those curves you see are these logistic regression generated curves. Along the x-axis, along the abscissa, you see all possible VRS-SO pretreatment scores from 0 to 72. Along the y-axis, you have 5-year sexual recidivism. And then you have different trajectories of change. So the blue line, this is a change score of 6. That's 1 standard deviation above the mean, just to let you know, which is high change. 3.5 is actually just the average of the sample overall, kind of splitting down the middle. Red is no change, which happens for a lot of people, unfortunately, and that's the trajectory of recidivism, and that's how it cuts across the categories. And so what we're working on right now is basically harmonizing the criterion referenced and norm reference groups, and we find that they actually line up really quite well. Even if you take somebody's post-treatment score, there's a good possibility that they could even be in the same nominal category as they are in terms of the criterion referenced category. And so we've done this for 10-year outcomes as well. And that's the whole ball of wax. So what the long and short of this is that these are non-arbitrary ways of coming up with categories of low, medium, and high, and these are more palatable labels, alternatives to low, medium, and high. This 5-category scheme, like very low, below average, and so on and so forth. Our post-treatment score still allows for movement between the nominal categories. Somebody can go from 4B to 4A, for instance. And for the most part, we find that the norm reference and criterion reference categories line up really quite well. So someone's post-treatment score will be associated with the nominal category, the same nominal category as it is for the criterion reference category. If there is a disconnect, then what we would probably do is go with the lower of 2 categories that are informed by the recidivism estimate. So if somebody had, say, a post-treatment score of 50, for instance, and they would, say, be within the well above average risk or 4B range, but let's say they had a baseline of, like, say, 67, for instance, and that 17 points of change would bring them down to a recidivism estimate that's characteristic of just the above average category, and you had, say, 4B versus 4A, you had norm reference estimate and criterion reference estimate, would probably go with the lower of the two. And a reasonable argument could be made in doing that. Give somebody the benefit of the doubt anyways when it comes to change. At least that's my argument. Thanks for your time and attention.